Hi. The purpose of this video is to provide an introductory overview of the federal acquisition process as it relates to software development services today. This is meant to provide a general overview and doesn't necessarily cover every single aspect of the acquisition process, and it may provide steps in a particular order that agencies may vary in their application. It's necessary to understand this process before getting into the later videos, which will talk about waterfall development and agile development. Understanding the process itself will let you understand why the virtues of one over the other make sense. So where does the federal acquisition process start for software development? Well, it typically starts with an identification of a need. This identification can come from a variety of places, from users, from management, CIO. Sometimes it's provided down from higher levels of legislation or policy prescription. Nevertheless, a need is identified, and that need is typically approved somewhere within the agency. After approving the need, then a government estimate is typically put together based on historical knowledge and technical expertise. It should be noted that it's widely accepted that government estimates are rarely extremely accurate, but merely provide the best estimate the government can with what they know in order to establish budgets and thresholds. Once the government estimate is established, then a budget allocation has to be made. Typically, there's a budget allocation approval process, and depending on the specifics of the requirement, color of money determinations are made. After the budget is approved, it will typically have to be placed onto commitment status and some sort of funding document. Once funding and needs are established, the requirements gathering will begin. Typically in the acquisition process as it is today, this is a very lengthy process. The reason for this is because it's necessary to identify all known requirements and final desired end states of an acquisition in order to submit it out for proposal. This process historically can take 1 to 2 years, sometimes more, depending on the availability of expertise. As requirements are gathered, they'll next start to move into the acquisition strategy process. This process involves documenting how the agency intends to acquire the particular services they need. All sorts of things will be taken into consideration, including existing vehicles within the agency, government-wide vehicles that are available for use, and new acquisitions, etc. Following the acquisition strategy, a plan is put together, and there's prescriptions within the FAR of elements that need to be included in this plan. And then the source selection plan will have to be developed, which will attempt to create an apples-to-apples comparison typically, and let offers know and the agency clearly dictate how the evaluation process will be carried out and what the selection factors will be for picking the vendor. This assumes a best value decision is being made, and typically the best value trade-off process is preferred for software development services. Following the source selection plan, the request is created. Now, this can be a request for quote or a request for proposal, but either way, it's everything that the vendors will see to let them know what it is they need to put together in order to respond to the government's requirements and be considered for selection. This is typically a very lengthy set of information. It's a lot of information for vendors to go through, and it takes them a good amount of time. The FAR has prescribed time limits. Typically, the portions of the FAR that are used for software development today require 30 to 45 days, depending on whether it's considered research and development type activities or not. Following the issuance of the request for, I'll just call it request for X, because it could be a quote or a proposal depending on which part of the FAR you're using. FAR 15, for example, would be a request for quote, a request for proposal, whereas FAR 8.4, GWACs, Federal Supply Schedules, would typically do a request for quote. Once that is issued, vendors will use the time period that they're given to go through the volume of information, and typically we'll have a question and answer period. In responding to these questions and answers, agencies are commonly required to have to make revisions to the request, and that subsequently results in additional time in the proposal period to allow vendors an opportunity to respond to the new information. After the time period is up, proposals are received. They're then evaluated to make sure they conform to the minimum requirements of the request, and then the proposal evaluation process starts. The evaluation team, which would have been identified in the source selection plan, will then use their technical expertise to meticulously go through the proposals, identifying strengths and weaknesses or complete failures to address the proposal, and then rank the proposals as they're submitted. This includes going through both the technical portions and the cost portions. It's typically easier for fixed price acquisitions. However, software development services are commonly bought using cost reimbursable methods. This will typically also require cost accounting systems on the part of the vendors, and that would have to be audited as well. Depending on the dollar values, there can be several different entities involved in reviewing all of this information, including security, auditing services, contracting officers, of course, program managers, etc. Finally, the decision is made and a recommendation is made to the source selection approving official, and that source selection approving official will have to make a decision. Once the decision's made, vendors are notified whether they were selected or not, and a window of protest opens up, which is 10 days from the period at which they are made aware of information. When they 10-day window, let's assume that a protest isn't received, although protests are fairly common in federal procurement. If proposals are not received, then the vendor that was selected can begin implementing their solution. Once they begin implementing it under typical software development as it is today, and this will be discussed in much greater detail in the video on waterfall development, then the implementation will begin as it was proposed, and any changes or deviations to that from the government side would have to result in a modification to the contract to allow the vendor to deviate from the master schedule that they originally proposed. Typically, in software development in the federal government as it is today, delivery is not received until everything is complete, and that is often 1 to 2 years, sometimes 5 to 10 years out from the point at which the proposals were accepted. And this concludes the video on the federal acquisition process. As I said, the next videos will discuss the approaches used today in greater detail, and then the recommendations for Agile development services and the value that that brings.